prairie rose for Emily. To make a prairie rose, it takes a clover and one bee, a bee and one clover. Revolution and reverie, which wakes, shakes, breaks, and quakes. To dream, perchance to rave, to glance, perhaps as light upon glissinging dew, at breaking dawn, or furtively at lover. And Reverie Alone will do, if bees and Waggle dance, and the revolutionaries are few.
All right, well, so a couple of days ago, I had done a reading that I introduced and promised would be a kind of close reading of a poem by Emily Dickinson. And of course, it wasn't really a very close reading at all, but it was a frame. It was a contextual frame under which, one arguably, right, could conceive of the work and production of a number of Emily Dickinson's poems as an expression of visionary experience, or what I referred to as mystical experience, and this lens of understanding Dickinson as visionary or mystic doesn't resolve all of the complexities and difficulties and paradoxes and contradictions of her poetry, but I suggested perhaps gives rise to a different set of figural values, through which she can be viewed in a different light, or at a different angle, or at a different slant. And the poem, of course, that I did this reading of and offered this lens for, begins with the line, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And I had thought about that slant and that perspective, in a number of different ways. In relationship to Dickinson's poetics, and in a certain sense, the way that she is socially constructed as a particular kind of subject, and some of the ways that that social construction of her subjectivity take on characteristics of lens or angle or context through which that she's viewed are interesting to me in particular, because they relate to arguments concerning cognitive differences, or perhaps the way that an individual who would choose, if we can really use that term, or opt, to confine herself to a kind of solitary existence or reclusiveness, right? The way that subjectivity is defined by certain authoritative discourses in our society and in our culture. Almost in medical terms, right? And that perhaps associate her with a kind of abnormal psychology, or a kind of rejection of certain aspects of social existence that marginalize her, and that characterize her in ways that can be redeemed, but aren't necessarily obviously positive from the outset. And since I've worked so much and for so long a time on these issues of the construction of subjectivity and particularly the marginalization of subjects within a variety of social domains, but those domains certainly include aesthetic and artistic and creatively, economically creative and economically exploitive, domains of human labor, and I've related those ideas to the labor of other entities as well, including the labor and industry of bees, particularly honeybees, who produce this food source, and these bees, who are female and who do this labor and produce this honey, of course, are exploited by by human beings who keep them in captivity and use them as slave labor to produce this honey, and you would think that ideas like this are fairly postmodern and wouldn't belong to the domain out of which Emily Dickinson is writing, but I recall this not really a novel but a romance by Hawthorne, and I think it's called the Blithedale Romance, which is basically his account of an attempt to participate in this communal living, in this transcendentalist projective utopia that I believe actually existed as a commune in Hawthorne's time, and of course he's very critical of the social living arrangements in this commune, and at one point he makes fun of the refusal of the members of a particular, I don't recall if it was a faction or if whether it was the entirety of the membership of this social unit, but their refusal to produce honey because they refer to it as an act of enslaving and stealing from the bees, and so that idea would have been available in Dickinson's time, even though it seems anachronistic. But in any case, Dickinson's work wasn't perhaps exploited in the same manner, and her isolation and her confinement perhaps wasn't as obviously economically exploitational or exploitive as the labor involved in the production of honey and the captivity of the honeybee, but nevertheless, later, particularly after her death, quite an, and I don't necessarily want all of the entailments of this word that I use to fall upon the publication of her writing, but the industry of publication certainly benefited from her voluminous production of poetry, and so in some ways we can metaphorize Emily Dickinson as a kind of honeybee in isolation, which is odd because honeybees, of course, work in large communities and communally, like Hawthorne's communal experience that he writes about in the Blaisdell Romance, but nevertheless, it doesn't take too much distortion, or too much optical reconceptualization to imagine in a strange, quirky and perhaps charming sort of way that Dickinson was this solitary, honeybee producing the product of these many poems as a kind of we can use the word metaphorically, as a kind of resource that was never consumed in her lifetime, but certainly we continue to consume it to this day, and like honey, it seems to have a certain longevity and lastingness to it that other food sources don't, right? Because once the transformation is made, via the work of the bees, it's fairly stable in its self-preservation. That is, unlike fruit, it doesn't have a limited shelf life or limited duration of usefulness, and as a source. And thinking about all of that, and thinking about this early poem of Dickinson's, to make a prairie, Aaron and I began a conversation regarding, the usefulness of this metaphor of the bee, and what it might mean in Emily Dickinson, and what it might mean as a kind of symbol or metaphor of self-portraiture, and who might represent the bee, and who might represent, in this particular poem, the clover. And in this reading, I want to talk a little bit about Aaron's poem, A Prairie Rose for Emily, and talk about some of the transformations that Aaron makes in from the original poem to make a prairie, and why perhaps he makes those transformations, and what those transformations might mean in terms of what Aaron wants to convey, and how they may shed some light on his understanding of Dickinson and what she's doing in this original poem, as well as what perhaps he's responding to in our contemporary social environment and the politics of today, and whether this moment that we exist in now has anything to do with this particular poem and what some or a variety of its meanings might convey rather. And so we'll do that, and I'll start briefly with we may begin line by line and observe what the transformations are. So let's start there, and then we can proceed into larger content areas and themes, and we may splinter off in a number of different directions and treat different subjects and topics and areas of interest, as they engage us. So I don't have a particular program in mind, but we can begin with this, provisional strategy of comparing, line by line transformations that Aaron makes in the poem. All right, so first of all, the title. Dickinson's title is "To Make a Prairie," and you notice that in Aaron's poem, it's not to make, so he shifted from the idea of making or working that certainly belongs to the semantic domain and the semantic field of bee as metaphor, worker, bee, right? And it's important to remember that these bees are, in terms of their biological gender or biological sex, that they're female. And they're not reproductive females, right? They don't give birth. Only the queen does that. But they possess all of the characteristics that belong to the genetics of the queen and are classified as or sorted as female. And the drones, whose task is sexual and whose task is simply and singularly, to mate with the queen and produce via sexual reproduction more bees. They don't participate in this labor that involves the relationship between the clover or other source of pollen and the bee, right? And so when Emily Dickinson refers to the task of making or working to produce a prairie, she's referring to the activity of these female, worker bees, and noting, that the sexed or gendered aspect of the bee that lies within the metaphor, I believe, is important. Is an important point in relating the relationship between the clover and the bee to Emily Dickinson, herself, as a kind of self-portrait of the labors of the poet. And we'll get into this more later, but her identifying the totality of the prairie, right, whose etymology belongs to this word for meadow, right? So the totality of this life spring or grassland or place of life that is represented by prairie and meadow, the claim here is made between two entities, one clover and one bee, or a clover and one bee, and one clover and a bee, which in fact is from the scientific point of view, not quite right, but belongs to and supports our reading of the strangeness of Emily Dickinson as a bee, but a bee in isolation from a community, but a bee nonetheless that just like these actual communities of female worker bees can in fact create the life and the living domain, right, and the field and the future, out of which and the entirety, of a prairie can be defined and exist as a consequence, right, of this particular production. So, all of that, perhaps suggested in the title, and then of course, Aaron's transformation here, Prairie Rose, for Emily, it does a number of things. First, it introduces the idea of a flower that doesn't belong to Dickinson's poem. She refers to the flower of the clover, right? And clover and bee are two interesting words because they don't really have non-trivial etymologies. The etymology for the word clover and the etymology for the word bee ultimately refer back to these species, the species of clover and the species of bee. And the scientific name for the word clover, which belongs to the genus Trifolium, refers to these three leaves which the clover has, right? Trifolium. But Emily doesn't choose that word. She chooses the word clover, and there's almost an argument here, like of identity, right? It's almost an argument of that this word, clover, and this word, bee, that lack in a certain way, etymological evolution, right? That they're chosen because they are precisely, so singular. And certainly, if we had introduced the notion of a clover being defined by the number of its leaves, and those leaves were 3, that would complicate the relationship between this one single thing and that one other single thing, which is repeated twice, and it's repeated in an interesting way in which the modifiers, right? One is an indefinite article modifier a, and one is a numerical adjectival modifier 1, and both of those adjectival modifiers, are used in relationship to each of the words, but only once, right? So a clover, and then it becomes one clover, and one bee, which becomes a bee. So it's not a chiasm, but it's an interesting transposition of those modifiers, and meaningfully as well, right? And with Aaron's title, what he does is he introduces a new flower the Prairie Rose, which of course, is a response to the prairie out of which the relationship and the product made by the relationship between the one clover and the one bee, is formed. And this rose, I believe there's a play here in what Aaron is doing. In this case, the bee and the clover, right, make together somehow this prairie, whose etymological root is meadow. And in this case, it's another flower, and it of course refers to one of the symbols for Texas, and that's probably an oblique reference to the ballad form and the song, the Yellow Rose of Texas, which in a way we could associate with Emily Dickinson, because many of her poems are ballads. And in fact, there's a ghost of a ballad in this particular poem, right? I mean, you can hear it particularly in the first line. And if I sing the Yellow Rose of Texas, then you'll pick it up and you'll hear it and you'll see it immediately. To make a prairie, and then what if we put rose after that prairie there? To make a prairie rose, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee it takes to make a reverie, and reverie alone will do if bees and rose are few. Anyway, you can hear the ghost of the ballad form, and it doesn't take much addition and revision to find it. But in the first line in particular, which is much longer than the rest of the poem, one feels the presence of that specter of ballad, and Darren seems to be aware of it, in more than one way. But what interests me more than that part of the revision or rewriting of the title is that in this instance, if we take the rose not as a rose for Emily, which clearly, obviously, also, and I won't fail to mention it, refers to the William Faulkner poem, right, A Rose for Emily, and in that sense addresses some of the issues that we began with, and the way that Emily Dickinson as a subject, right, and as a subject positioned or positionalized by literary and perhaps a sort of medical discourse of performativity, might occupy this place of a sort of isolate, madness, or the solitary recluse, and Aaron's reference to the William Faulkner short story perhaps points in that direction, and hints at, suggests the way that Emily Dickinson as subjectivity is socially constructed by this kind of performativity, and it hints that perhaps the poem will address this, and perhaps part of the content of the poem will address this social construction. That's there, but what interests me even more than that is the way that in Prairie Rose, the third word in Aaron's title is also a verb, as in to rise, to stand, to lift up, and as such, it's interesting because in this poem, the work that's done between the one bee and the one clover, or between a bee and a clover, because both are articulated, right, in that transposition of those adjectival positions, they make the prairie, and then something else can make a prairie too, but we won't get there yet. If bees are few, and just will point out that she doesn't mention if clover are few, but we could take that either way, because it's not mentioned. We could say, well, let's assume that she means clover is few as well, because there is a symbiotic relationship, right, between the pollen and the pollinator. But we could, imagine it otherwise and say, well, she only mentioned that bees were few, but somehow clover is still there. And there are other pollinators, right? Like there are butterflies, and there are other kinds of flies, and there are different types of coleoptera, beetles, that also act as pollinators, and ants can be pollinators as well. And there are, there are other hymenoptera, and there are other, wasps that pollinate as well, and so if she's referring to a specific kind of bee, either the honeybee or the bumblebee, and I, will make much of the honeybee, and perhaps it's because of the choice of clover, and clover is often associated with the production of honey. But bumblebees also, are clover pollinators and associated with clover. And so perhaps this prairie, that's created doesn't belong, to that domain of the social. And I've been assuming, that bee means European honeybee. But if bee means bumblebee, and in this poem it makes more sense as such, right? Because there's one clover and one bee, then this is interesting, because this is a symbiotic relationship that exists in the wilds of America, and in the landscape of America, before the arrival of the European honeybee, and before the arrival, presumably of European culture, and that that selection makes it interesting work, because what's being produced is not a product, right, that supports a particular market or industry or culture or even survival of a community, in the way that Hawthorne's response to the community in the Blithedale Romance was about economics, in the same way that Walden was about economics, right? And even self-professed account of how this survival is to be an economic one, and as misrepresentational as Thoreau is, because in fact, as I understand it, at least, Emerson's wife did his cooking and washed his laundry and did most of the work. But nevertheless, it's presented as how this self-made man survives under these conditions without much support from a community or a society of interlocking bees. And if we take this bee as a bumblebee, and more I'm thinking that this is the more apt metaphor for this poem, and that more and more I'm thinking that Emily Dickinson was probably aware of that it even becomes more clearly an example of self-portraiture here, right? So in getting back to Aaron's transformation, a prairie rose, for Emily, that somehow, in honor of, perhaps, or to greet her, or or as an act of autonomy of its own, because of perhaps the labor that she did to produce it. It also, rose to her, and what that rose means, and in rising, and whether it's an act of honoring, or a greeting, or metaphorically, perhaps, rising to her level is interesting to me, and hopefully we'll be able to talk more about that, given the rest of the content of the poem. All right, so let's go on to the first line rather, and I've already said a lot about it. I've said that it seems to have the ghost of or specter, or a scaffolding remains of ballad form, which if that is the case, and the scaffolding of the ballad form is most clearly represented in the first line, which is the longest, of course, line of the poem, then the rest of the poem can perhaps be seen as an illustration of the way that Dickinson, deconstructs, or perforates, or fragments that ballad form. And in that sense, it becomes very interesting, because the sentences are also fragmented, right? And the particularly the central area here, and reverie, but in Aaron's revision, it's interesting, because he adds a lot of capitalization, and then he doesn't change the verb make, but perhaps by failing, to capitalize make, he emphasizes the internal rhyme that he adds as a final rhyme, but the internal rhyme is there in the Dickinson, right? Make and take, and it's slant if one takes that s on the end of the verb take as challenging the rhyme between take and make, but it's nevertheless an internal slant rhyme, right? Make and take, and here he features it as end rhyme, and perhaps also suggests that in doing so, that recognizes that initial line is a bit too long in a certain way, at least too long not to be relevant in its length, and clearly, right, stands out from the other very abbreviated lines, particularly the end reverie, but the rest of the lines are very, very short as well. And of course, from a larger perspective, he takes this. So we have an identity, right, in B, but let's call it a rhyme. So A, B, and then I'm sorry, A, and then B, right, in the 5-line poem. A, if we take the identity B and B as a rhyme, and then B, and Aaron breaks that up, significantly, and in his, you see, let's see, so A, B, C, B, A, A, DD E E and then I think okay, lover is a visual rhyme with clover. So that's it's a sight rhyme, but I think that's not F but C. And then let's see, and then we have, so that was E, so then we have F, and then I can't remember what chance was. Was chance D or E? But anyway, we have that rhyme, and then we have F again. So let's see if I can do it again. So A, B, C, B, D, D, E, E. I think the F is a pawn. So F, F, and then C again, and then G, and then E or F. I can never remember whether that dance and chants are E or F, and then G again. So so it's a sonnet, actually. It's just it's a sonnet that that's a bit rearranged with the final rhyming couplet not rhyming and not being final, but it's nevertheless a kind of sonnet. So it's interesting that Aaron transformed whatever this form is, which seems to be what I call like a ghost ballad, like a ghost ship, which seems to be a ghost ballad into a sonnet. And I think Aaron's representation of sonnet form is at least as clear as Dickinson's representation of ballad form here. At least it is, to my eye. And the rhymes are interesting and suggest perhaps a kind of I would suggest a kind of I don't want to call it obsessive quality, but frugal isn't really quite the word that I'm quite looking for. But there's an idea in the parsimony principle, and if parsimony principle is taken as something positive rather than the negative, and not in the sense of stinginess, but of economic resourcefulness. There's a kind of economic resourcefulness in which when each of the word line endings relate as rhyme, back to an earlier one, and in a sense, nothing is wasted, and the movement is certainly not extraordinarily innovative, but that it's surprising and curious. And if we wanted perhaps to relate it to the content of the poem, we could imagine it as the movement of a bee, which is also apparently, to the human observing eye, somewhat happenstance and arbitrary. And in Aaron's poem, it's certainly much more happenstance and arbitrary than it is in Dickinson's poem, in which you have the bee, the reverie, and the two A's, and you have then do and few at the end. The rhyme changing to switching there in the last two segments. So, in a sense, the form that Aaron elaborates here is more of a dance than it is in the Dickinson poem, and Dickinson doesn't mention dance explicitly, although this expression reverie, which interestingly has either an archaic spelling or she perhaps spells incorrectly. I'm not sure how reverie was spelled in the 19th century, so I can't say. I do know that that reverie does have an evolving etymology, unlike the word for clover and bee, and that it relates to the French word for dream, and also that etymology involves relationships to other words such as rave and related to both dreaming and to dancing. This frolic or reverie, or reverie is the word, but this rage, this dance, this frolic, but also this daydream, or being transported to this imaginary swirl, and perhaps imagining the dance of the mystic dance, right, of the whirling dervishes that transport the mind to this domain. And perhaps that's the imagery, that within this whirl and swirl and twirl and this reverie of this dream, that one in fact creates what is the prairie, if bees and perhaps Clover are few. So that idea of dance is represented here, and then Aaron later specifically relates it to our space-time travel coordinates as Waggle dance, and the whole socio-political project that's a metaphor for. And that is perhaps, but we haven't gotten there yet, is what allows him to introduce this term, revolution, which both plays with the revolution of the 360-degree circle that is required for us to understand even how the Waggle dance becomes a communication, and how one bee communicates to another bee the location of the flower, whether it be clover or prairie rose or other flower, and what it means in terms of the way that we use that 360-degree circle in that metaphor of the Waggle dance and its displacements as directionalities and instructions for the dancers in the project of radical actions and revolutions, and that's not yet all divulged in that first line. To make a prairie rose, it takes what does it take? Well, for Dickinson, it takes a clover and one bee, and then she repeats that, and again, we're reminded here, or I intend to remind us here that she is perhaps, referring to the bumblebee and not the European, honeybee, because bumblebees, can be solitary, and to imagine the honeybee, even though we have this word clover and we think of clover honey and often associate, clover and honeybees together, but we can easily imagine it as a relationship between the bumblebee and and the clover. And the reason that that's important, in Dickinson, again, is constructing her and this image of her as a solitary figure, and what that might mean in relationship to productivity and to source, right? And the claim here, in a certain respect, is quite radical, because a prairie is hardly solitary. It's an Umwelt, right? And it's in a sense, it's a world. It's a constellation of an ecosystem of living creatures in relationship to one another. And one would think that it would take all of these various social elements and engagements to create such an Umwelt or ecological system. But the claim, and it's an extraordinary one that's being made, is that it can all be made by a single clover and a single bee. And perhaps with this added element, reverie, or that is dance and dream, right? And then the claim, further made, that even the bee and the clover, and this is where the portraiture become bizarre in a certain way, or odd and strange and difficult to decipher, if it is in fact a relationship between the bee and the bee is the poet, and by virtue of its author, therefore Dickinson, and the clover is some content or some desire that the author or the speaker or the maker has in relationship to the process of making. Then the odd claim here is that even the maker and the content or the object of desire or the source or the material, even the material, perhaps the paper, the page, the space, the room of one's own, the window to look out of, the topicality, the time, the zeitgeist, whatever that clover represents in metaphorical terms, even that is unnecessary, because the dance and the dream are enough where makers are few, and or workers are few, and then to become dissolved in the dance and not even see oneself as this separate source or maker, weaver or pollinator, separate from the clover. And the clover, whether it still exists or not, is uncertain, as we mentioned before. But to dissolve that and to imagine that the dance is all that's left, but where would the dance begin if and where would the reverie begin, as dance or as dream, if there were no dreamer, and if there were no, but perhaps one dream is left, the dream of the one bee. Because bees are few. So the bee is perhaps still the dreamer, but merely, not dreaming of other bees, perhaps dreaming of itself and the clover in reverie, or herself and the clover in reverie. And Aaron leaves that largely the same. What he does, though, is he reorganizes if you want to call it, syntagm. And you see in Dickinson that she refers to a clover and one bee, and then she reverses, right? The relationship, transposes the relationships between the adjectival modifiers, the indefinite pronoun a, and the indefinite article a, and the numerical adjective, one, she reverses those, but she doesn't transpose the order of the clover and the bee. And what you notice that Aaron did was he did the opposite. He transposed the orders of the nouns, but he did not transpose the orders of the indeterminate article and the numerical adjectives. And I'm not sure entirely what to make of that, other than that if we imagine that this is a dance and that the movement of these particular words, are representation of a bee dancing around a flower, whether that flower is clover or prairie rose or both, going back and forth from clover and prairie rose, that Aaron's poem, if you know the Dickinson poem, right, calls attention to the fact that these words are moving around. And so, and perhaps in that sense, the dance becomes, metacognitive of itself, or, you could say that, attention is being drawn, on the part, of the reader to notice that the words are dancing, on the page, and in the manner of a bee, right? And bee and clover in some ways are more substantial than these articles, than these indefinite articles and adjectives, right? And less abstract in a certain way because they refer to the world, whereas the word a and the word one, the word a is merely grammatical, and the word one refers to abstraction by numerical value, and in that way apply to a greater level of material things and abstract conceptual things than these, as I'm making claim, more representational elements bee and clover do. All right, so that's interesting, and then let's go on to Emily Dickinson's third line and Reverie, and we've talked quite a bit about that already. The interesting thing that we mentioned before was that Aaron adds this idea of revolution. And that refers to, the dance as spinning, and therefore the waggle dance, but also, to other kinds of revolution as well, including political and social revolutions. And this is this begins the what's clearly, delineated here as a second stanza. Oh, and I failed to notice that. He adds these dashes, which, is perhaps like a wink, in to those familiar with Emily Dickinson's work, and particularly the evolution of that work, and also the way that work is either the original materiality and representation of that work, whether it's respected or whether it's rejected and abandoned by publishers and replaced by more conventional organizations of syntax and punctuation, right? And so this is perhaps a nod to those familiar with those dashes, but interestingly, like each of these, if you could refer to them as sentences, does end with a period. So that's interesting too. I'm not sure what entirely to make of that, but then so those dashes, and then we have a dash in every. Well, we have a dash in every stanza, but the final couplet, which is interesting, which is also a displacement, right? And perhaps it's displaced from being final. Perhaps that's a pun on the word displacement and the way that the waggle dance is a form of linguistic displacement. I'm not certain, but it may be. All right, so revolution and reverie, and those are almost identities here in a certain way, and that could easily have become a comma, right? And or perhaps not. If revolution and reverie are different things, then we have to consider how the spinning and how the transformation of a social condition is separate from the imagining, the dreaming, and the dancing, and the wildness of the reverie, right? Which wakes. Okay, there's none of that, going on in Dickinson. So in a way, he's being more explanatory and explicit. Which wakes, and I suppose that has something to do with being woken up, either as a visionary or as a social-political subject into one's own identity and self-understanding. Shakes, which is interesting in terms of shakes and quakes. You can hardly fail to notice the relationship between shakers and Quakers, particularly as it refers to this Dickinson poem and what would have been these interesting receptions of the spirit, right, that manifest themselves in the form of shaking and quaking, that relate to an aspect of Dickinson's world that we might forget in our time, and this kind of dance that was allowed in these religious communities when other kinds of representations and cultural manifestations were forbidden or certainly frowned upon, right? Which wakes, shakes, and there's an interesting one, breaks, so what revolution breaks is interesting. So it's not merely a dance, but also a breaking. And none of that break, which is also an internal rhyme, right? All of these are internal rhyme: wake, shakes, breaks, and quakes. So Dickinson focuses on the making and the taking, right? And in this case, taking isn't to steal or to take away, but what it requires. So making requires, like there's a relationship between the creation, the building, and the resources that are required to do the building. And here, we have that same internal rhyme, making and taking. So you have a making, a creating, and then you have a resources. But then you have all of these other suggestions as well that, beyond that, there's a awakening and a kind of enlightenment, perhaps, or the waking is so interesting because the reverie, if it's a daydream or a dream, is antithetical to the idea of waking. But perhaps the waking belongs to the revolution and the spinning, as well as the reverie belongs to the confusion and the frenzy, right? Shakes and breaks and quakes, and it's not too hard to understand how the verb breaks relates to this noun revolution, which clearly breaks with tradition, cultural values, and the antiquated epistemological structures, metaphysics, presumptions of the past, right? All right, okay, and then there's this weird, okay, and I don't even really need to go to the Dickinson to note this, but there's this weird invocation of Shakespeare and from Hamlet's soliloquy here. So to dream, right? Perchance, but then he broke up the word perchance, and that follows right after this word, breaking and quaking, like as if an earthquake came through and both introduced Shakespeare and broke it up, right? And then that chance, of course, is there, to relate to this fundamental word that Aaron adds, that perhaps is intuitively there in Dickinson's Reverie, but that it is really foregrounded here in the relationship to the bee. Aaron chooses honeybees because it's not, bumblebees don't do waggle dances. however he read the relationship that is established between the clover and the one bee, whether it was a honeybee and Emily Dickinson had misread the singularity of that bee, or whether it was a bumblebee, however he read it, whether he understood that Dickinson was referring to a bumblebee or not, he's clearly chosen European honeybees here, because they are the bees that do the waggle dance, right? And that's interesting, because it's a claim about community and the social nature of this dance, and it's a claim that no, you need lots of organized communities of bees. But again, but maybe you don't, because he still says Reverie alone will do if you don't have them, right? And even revolutions are few. So the claim, though, when you switch from bumblebee to honeybee and add this aspect of the waggle dance, one of the interesting things I think that happens is the way that Aaron turns it, at least, is you will something the reverie will do, but clearly, like, the product will be different, right? Because he relates it both to the metaphor, as in bees in the waggle dance, and to the more explicit referent of revolutions and revolutionaries, and perhaps meaning that we'll survive no matter what, whether we can change the society or not, and that reverie will be our domain, and the reverie, or perhaps the dance and the daydream, but and perhaps there are more meanings than that we'll get to. But let's go back up to where we left off. All right, so to dream, perchance, to rave. All right, so what's the Shakespeare? What does Hamlet say? He says to dream, perchance, to sleep. All right, and therefore to go back to sleep, and presumably that means something other than being wakeful and dancing. But here, to dream, perhaps to rave, right? So that draws it into this other sense of dream, like more like the dream that is described by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? And his dream to change the social conditions and the status quo of our social inscription within economies and orders of oppression and social hierarchy, right? And so dream becomes a bit different. It is not the dream of going to sleep and getting away from one's troubles, as it is in Shakespeare's Hamlet, but rather to dream of a future, to dream of a dance, to dream of a reverie, and to rave, and perhaps rage, and then interesting, a repetition that doesn't belong to the Shakespeare, to dream, perchance, and then whatever that splitting of chance is interesting, because it belongs to this whole discourse and binary opposition between intentionality versus chance. And that's, of course, something that's fascinating to Aaron and that he plays with all the time. So per chance, how would this become an accident? How would the dream of the future, the visionary's dream, be as it is via chance, as opposed to pattern and intentional organization? So that's interesting in and of itself. Per chance, to rave, and then to glance, right? Okay, so that's to look or something that shines upon, and then he says perhaps as light upon. Okay, so glance as in glancing upon the water, or glistening there, and that's an interesting way of formulating it. Glistening, and then he adds the singing. So it's shining and it's singing. So it's singing is shining. That neologism fascinates me there. So this dew, right, perhaps on a flower petal, at breaking dawn, glistening under the sun, and singing, right, singing the song of this, maybe it's on a flower petal or maybe it's on something else. But this glistening dew that is singing at the breaking of dawn, and then that breaking comes back up here to that word, or furtively. So he's looking at two different meanings of this word glance, right? Glancing off the water, or glancing off the dew, this light, but also glancing at a lover, which is presumably a reference to the symbolic significance of this relationship between the bee and the clover, right? Because all flowers are sexual organs of these flowering plants, right? They're the sexual organ of the flower. So they're not only merely symbols of sexuality, but they are in fact sexual organs. And so the relationship that the bee has, whether bumble or honey, to the clover is hard to ignore or dismiss as something other than sexual. It can certainly be something more than sexual, but it's hard to take that out of the equation, right? And so when we say here, or when Dickinson says that when this relationship, which is sexual, right, is limited, she doesn't say that it's entirely absent, but she says if bees are few. So if bees are few, these kinds of relationships, which one can't ignore as being sexualized, can be limited, right, by the number of one participant in the relationship. But she adds that will persist, where reverie, whatever that word reverie means, and we've been looking at it as dance and transport and daydream and exuberance and enthusiasm and twirl and whirlpool in a sense, and transport in the sense of ecstasis, being transported to a different domain of consciousness. So I like reverie as ecstasis, right? And reverie alone will do, ecstasis will do if partners, perhaps in this relationship are few. And that, is perhaps what's going on here. And I'm wondering, secretly, furtively, perhaps, both the furtive glance, right, which is a idiomatic expression that we have in common to the language, but perhaps relates to the furtive message in the Dickinson poem in an interesting way. So this singing dew at breaking dawn, or furtively, glancing at a lover, and reverie alone will do. If bees in Waggle dance, a lot going on there. Bees in Waggle dance. So the ability to communicate, where the resources are located, right? So Waggle dancing for the honeybee means it's an instruction for the other bees to locate this resource of these flowers and the pollen that they provide in the production of honey and the economy of bees. So if bees in Waggle dance are few, for whatever reason, they can't do their dance, they can't communicate, maybe they're maybe some of the books in their libraries are banned, or they're not allowed to speak, or they're censored. Metaphorically, could relate to any of those ideas, right? And or revolutionaries, individuals, willing to do the work. So revolutionaries, in this sense, is that willing to negotiate the 360-degree circle, understand the message, revolutionaries, meaning the bees that do the waggle dance, right? Because they go around in circles and tell others where these resources are located. And so if you can't find these, what's the reverie? Is it simply the swarm of bees? Is it simply the communication of endorphic pleasures of the dance, or is it the suggestion, I think, from a metapoetic expression is whether these bees are there to do the dance or get the dance or find the resources or not. There's a certain pleasure in the creation of the work itself, and whatever the dance might be, whether it's waggle or otherwise, and perhaps it's just that flitting from one position to the next as bee, that and the imagining of it, that even if the revolution cannot persist, offers a place to dream, perchance to rave, to glance perhaps as light upon a future of glistening dew at breaking dawn, and the furtivity of the glance upon the lover, and I guess that's the that ultimately is it. However, it's changed in Aaron's version, makes it very like Dickinson's poem. And the other day I had noted that incorrectly, obviously, that there isn't a lot of social content in Emily Dickinson's poetry, and that's true in this one sense. There's not a lot of overt social political content in Emily Dickinson's poetry, right? In the same manner in which we can find overt political content in this poem of Aaron's, particularly in these two words, revolution and revolutionary. But in some other words too, if we draw them out a bit, and here the social political content, is entirely and exclusively, covert, right, and belongs to the realm of the hidden, and if the waggle dance, is belongs to the linguistic isn't the right word, but the communicative understanding of the honeybee, somewhat exclusively, the dance that the bee and the clover perform, if this bee is a bumblebee, is even more an idioglossia and almost not a communication at all, because it exists just in this unique relationship between the two entities who have apparently developed their own language in the reverie that remains obscure, not only to human consciousness, but to perhaps other bumblebees and other clover, and that, I think, is somewhat challenged in Aaron's revisions, in which making the dance a reference to the waggle dance, and perhaps to our construction of waggle dance as space-time communication coordinate system, allows that notion of revolutionaries being few still remain open as revolutionaries, being, possible.
A prairie rose for Emily. To make a prairie rose, it takes a clover and one bee, a bee and one clover. Revolution and reverie, which wakes, shakes, breaks, and quakes. To dream, perchance to rave, to glance, perhaps as light upon glissinging dew, at breaking dawn, or furtively at lover. And Reverie Alone will do, if bees and Waggle dance. And the revolutionaries are few.